The wagon broke down 2 miles from the ranch, and by the time she reached his gate on foot, she had a baby on her hip, a boy holding each hand, and exactly 11 cents to her name. Caleb Hardin saw her from the barn and assumed she was lost. Then he saw the children. Then he saw her shoes, split at the seams, bound with strips of cloth. Then he saw the way she lifted her chin when she caught him looking, as if daring him to say a single word about her ruin. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I was told a man out here might need a cook, or a washerwoman, or anything at all." "Who told you that?" "A man in town. He may have been lying." Caleb looked at the 3 children. The smallest, the baby, had begun to cry in that thin, exhausted way that Bobbies cry when they have run out of strength to cry properly. The 2 boys stared at him with the flat, hollow eyes of children who had learned not to expect much. He should have said no. He had no use for a widow and 3 mouths. He had buried his own family on this land and sworn he would never again be responsible for keeping anyone alive. Instead, he heard himself say, "Stay as long as you need." Neither of them understood in that moment that those 4 words would undo everything they each believed about themselves. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she was 29 years old, though the road had aged her past that. She had been pretty once, in the way of women who laugh easily, and somewhere beneath the dust and the hunger that prettiness remained, in the strong line of her jaw and the dark hair she kept pinned no matter how the wind fought her. Her eyes were the gray of a winter sky just before it decides to snow. She had grown up the daughter of a Kentucky schoolteacher, which meant she could read, write, do sums, name the capitals of distant countries and quote scripture, and none of it had kept her children fed. Her husband Thomas had been a dreamer. He had moved them west on the promise of land, then died of fever before the land was ever theirs, leaving her with 3 children and a debt she could not pay. The bank took the claim. A neighbor took the oxen as payment, and Ruth had taken what was left, which was her children and her pride, and started walking. Her strength was that she did not break. She had learned that breaking was a luxury for women with somewhere soft to fall, and she had nowhere soft anywhere in the world. Her wound was simpler. She had loved a man who promised her everything and delivered her to a grave and a debt. And so she had decided, somewhere on that long road, that she would never again depend on a man's promises. Promises were wind. She would trust only her own 2 hands. Her hidden fear was that her children would look at her one day the way she sometimes looked at herself in still water, and see a woman who had failed them. That was why she was lonely, not for lack of people, for lack of anyone she would allow herself to lean on. Caleb Hardin was 36, and he had not spoken more than 10 words to another living soul in some time before she arrived. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of work, with sandy hair going gray at the temples, and a beard he kept trimmed only because his late wife had hated when he let it grow wild. His face was weathered brown by the sun, and there were deep lines beside his eyes that might once have come from smiling, though no one in the county could remember the last time they had. He ran 400 acres alone. He had cattle, horses, a barn that needed mending, and a house that was too quiet. He was a good rancher, patient with animals, hard on himself, and stubborn as the rock that ran beneath his fields. His strength was endurance. He could outwork any 2 hired men, ride through any storm, and bury any grief so deep that strangers thought he had none. But he had grief enough for 3 lifetimes. 5 years before, a winter fever had come through and taken his wife, Sarah, and their little girl, Emma, within a single week. He had dug both graves himself because the ground was frozen and no one else would. He had not let anyone help. He had decided that day that love was a debt the world always came to collect, and that the only way to stay safe was to owe nothing and need no one. His hidden fear was that he had let them die, that a better man, a richer man, a man who had ridden faster for the doctor, would have saved them. He never said this aloud. He carried it the way he carried everything, in silence in his chest, like a stone he had swallowed. That was why he was lonely. He had built a fortress of solitude, and then discovered too late that he was the prisoner inside it. So when Ruth Calloway walked through his gate, each of them looked at the other and decided immediately that they understood exactly what they were seeing. Ruth looked at Caleb and saw a hard man, a cold man, the kind of man who said stay as long as you need, with his mouth while his eyes counted the cost of her children's bread. She had met men like him before, men who offered shelter and then expected something for it. She resolved to work hard, keep her distance, and be ready to leave the moment his charity turned to a price. Caleb looked at Ruth and saw a fragile thing, a widow worn down to nothing, a woman who would weep at the first hardship and need to be carried. He expected her to last a week. Soft hands, he thought, watching her cross his yard. City raised. She'll cook a few meals badly and then cry to go back to town. They were both completely wrong about each other, and it would take the whole of a hard season to prove it. The first morning set the tone for everything. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did, and found her already in his kitchen. She had lit the stove, found the flour and the lard, and was rolling out biscuits with the baby asleep in a basket at her feet, and the two boys carrying in firewood without being asked. "You don't have to do all that the first day," he said, gruffer than he meant to be. She did not look up. "I don't take charity, we earn our keep where we go." "Suit yourself." The biscuits, when he tasted them, were the best he had eaten in 5 years. He did not tell her so. He ate 6 of them in silence and went out to the barn feeling, for reasons he could not name, faintly outmaneuvered. That afternoon the trouble started. He came in from mending fence to find she had moved his late wife's chair, just shifted it a few feet to sweep beneath it and set it down again facing the window. A small thing, a nothing. Caleb crossed the room in 4 strides and put the chair back exactly where it had been, hard enough that the legs barked against the floor. "Don't touch that," he said. "Don't ever touch that." Ruth stood very still. The boys froze. The baby began to cry. She could have apologized. A woman with 11 cents and 3 children ought to have apologized. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then mark the things in this house I am not to clean, Mr. Hardin, and I will leave them to rot in peace." The silence stretched long and tight between them. "It was my wife's," he said finally. The words came out cracked. Ruth's face changed then, but only a little. "I see," she said. "I'll leave it where she left it." She picked up the baby. She did not say she was sorry, because she understood, suddenly and completely, that this was not a man who wanted sorrow handed back to him. This was a man drowning in his own, and that recognition frightened her more than his anger had, because it was the first time she had looked at Caleb Hardin and seen not a threat but a wound. That night, lying awake in the small room off the kitchen with her children breathing around her, she thought, "This house is haunted, and the ghost is still alive and sleeping under the same roof." The weeks that followed were a slow education for them both. She learned he was not cold. He was careful, in the way of a man who had decided that warmth cost too much. She watched him with the animals, watched him sit half the night in the barn with a laboring cow, his big hands gentle as a midwife's, murmuring to it in a low voice he never used with people. She watched him leave a portion of his own supper, again and again, on the smallest boy's plate when he thought no one noticed. She learned that the gruffness was a door, not a wall, and once or twice she found herself standing on the other side of it, knocking. He learned that she was not fragile. He learned it the day a steer broke through the fence and charged, and Ruth, instead of running, put herself between it and her children and waved her apron and shouted until the beast veered off. He found her afterward shaking with fury, not fear. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could they," she answered, nodding at her boys. "I'd do it again." He learned that she could read when he found her teaching her sons their letters by firelight with a stick and a patch of ash on the hearth. He had never finished his own schooling. He could sign his name and read a brand and little else, and it had shamed him quietly all his life. One evening he set a ledger in front of her, his accounts a mess of scrawls and guesses. "I can't make these numbers come right," he admitted, and it cost him to admit it. She took the book and the pencil, and by lamplight she set his whole year in order, found 2 errors that had been cheating him for months, and showed him where a buyer in town had been shorting him on every head of cattle he sold. Caleb stared at the neat columns, then he stared at her. Where did a widow learn bookkeeping? From a father who believed a woman ought to be able to count the money men try to take from her. She closed the book. He was right. Something shifted in Caleb's chest that night, something that had been frozen so long he had forgotten it could move at all. The boys took to him before either adult would admit it. The older boy, Samuel, who was 9 and had grown old before his time, began following Caleb to the barn each morning. Caleb pretended to be annoyed and taught him everything: how to read a horse's mood, how to throw a rope, how to mend a fence so it held. The younger boy, Eli, who was 6, decided Caleb's leg was the finest place in the world to fall asleep, and Caleb, who had not held a child since he buried his own, sat frozen the first time it happened, afraid to breathe. Ruth watched from the doorway. She saw the hard man's hand come down, slow and uncertain, to rest on her son's small head. She saw his throat work. She turned away before he could see her face, because her own eyes had filled, and she would not let him know it. The turning point came in November, with the first hard cold. Caleb had been out checking the herd and got caught in sleet, and he came home soaked and shivering and would not say a word about it. By midnight, he was burning with fever. Ruth knew that fever. She had watched it take her husband. The sight of Caleb laid low by it nearly broke the resolve she had spent her whole life building. She did not break, she fought. For 3 days and 3 nights she did not truly sleep. She broke the fever with cold cloths and broth and stubbornness. She sat beside his bed and she did the one thing she had sworn never to do again, which was to need a man to live. And in the depth of the second night, in the worst of it, Caleb began to talk. Out of his head with fever, he spoke to people who were not there. He spoke to Sarah. He begged her forgiveness. He told her he should have ridden faster, that the snow had been so deep, that by the time the doctor came it was already too late, and it was his fault, his fault. He should have saved Emma, his little girl. He should have saved them both. Ruth sat in the dark and listened to a strong man confess the thing that had been killing him slower than any fever, and she understood him at last, all the way down. The moved chair, the silence, the portion of supper slipped onto her boy's plate. This was not a cold man. This was a man so afraid of failing the people he loved that he had decided never to love anyone again. She took his burning hand in both of hers. "It wasn't your fault," she whispered. "Do you hear me, Caleb Hardin? Some things the snow just takes. You can't ride fast enough for all of them. Nobody can." She did not know if he heard. But near dawn the fever broke, and when his eyes opened, clear at last, the first thing he saw was her face above his, gray-eyed and exhausted and fierce, and the first thing he understood was that she had stayed. Nobody had stayed before. He had never let them. He did not have the words for what he felt, so he said only, "You didn't have to do that." And she said, "Yes, I did," and went to make him broth so he would not see her cry. Something had changed in that sick room, and they both knew it, and neither of them dared name it. Winter deepened, and so did everything else. It was no longer master and cook in that house. It was something with no name that either would speak aloud. But it was in the way he saved the seat beside him at the table, in the way she mended his shirts before her own children's, in the long quiet evenings when the boys slept, and the two of them sat by the fire, her with her sewing, him whittling a horse for Eli, the silence between them gone warm and easy as an old quilt. One night he taught her to play a hand of cards and laughed for the first time in 5 years, a rusty, surprised sound, when she beat him soundly 3 times running. The sound of his own laughter seemed to startle him into stillness. He looked at her across the firelight. "Sarah used to laugh like that," he said quietly. "I'd near forgotten the shape of it in a room." Ruth set down her cards. "You loved her very much." "I did." "That's not a thing to be ashamed of, Caleb, or to bury yourself with." He looked at his hands. "I don't rightly know how to do this," he admitted. "Whatever this is, I closed the door on it a long time ago and threw the key down a well." "I know," she said softly. "I threw mine down the same well. I told myself I'd never lean on a man again as long as I lived." "And—" She met his eyes. "And then I had to break that promise to keep you breathing, and I find I'm not as sorry as I thought I'd be." It was the closest either of them had come to saying it. The fire popped. Neither of them moved to close the small distance left between them, but it was there now, named or not, real as the warmth on their faces. Then the crisis came, the way crises do, all at once and from the direction no one was watching. A man rode out from town on a gray afternoon. His name was Harlan Cobb, and he held the note on the late Thomas Calloway's debts, the debt Ruth had thought she'd left behind when the bank took the claim. He had tracked her across 2 counties. He carried papers, and the law, such as it was out there, was on his side. He stood in Caleb's yard and laid it out plain. Ruth owed $300 she did not have. By the territory's accounting, a widow's debts could be discharged in only 2 ways. She could pay, or she could marry and let the debt pass to a husband willing to assume it, with a man of property to vouch for it before the magistrate. And Harlan Cobb, who had a hard mouth and a soft, grasping look in his eye when he glanced at Ruth, made it clear which solution he preferred. "I'm a patient man," he said. "I'll forgive the whole sum. A woman alone with 3 children can't be choosy. You'll come back to town with me and we'll make it legal and your troubles are over." Ruth went white. She had walked across half the territory to escape exactly this, the idea that her only worth lay in being handed to whatever man would settle her accounts. "I'd sooner take the children back on the road," she said. "Then I'll have the law take the children to the county home," Cobb answered, "and you to debtor's confinement. Your choice, Mrs. Calloway. You've got till the magistrate sits Friday next." He tipped his hat and rode off, certain of his victory. That night the house was silent in the old, terrible way. Ruth sat at the table with her face in her hands. Everything she had built on her own 2 hands, every mile she had walked to stay free, all of it had caught up with her at last. Caleb stood in the doorway a long time. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from her. "There's a way," he said. "Don't," she did not lift her head. "Don't you dare offer to pay it. I won't be bought free by you any more than by him. I won't trade one man's ownership for another's." "I wasn't going to offer to pay it." She looked up. "I was going to ask you to marry me," Caleb said. "Not to settle a debt. Cobb can have his $300 and choke on it. I'll write him a draft in the morning whether you say yes or no, and you'll owe me nothing and be free as the day you were born to walk out that gate." He stopped. His hands, those big steady hands, were shaking. "I'm asking the other thing separate. I'm asking because this house was a grave before you walked into it, and your boys have made it a home, and you've gone and thawed something in me I swore was dead and buried. I'm asking because I'd ride through any storm there is for you, and I have been, and I want to keep on doing it. Not because you owe me. Because I love you, Ruth Calloway. I didn't aim to, but I do." It was the most words he had spoken at one time in 5 years. Ruth stared at him, and the woman who had sworn she would never again depend on a man's promises sat looking at the one man she believed would actually keep one. "Say it again," she whispered, "the part that's got nothing to do with the debt." "I love you," he said. "I have for a while now, I just hadn't dug up the courage." She began to cry, finally, after all those dry and stubborn months, but she was smiling through it. "Then yes," she said, "not to be saved, I'll save myself, thank you, but to stand beside you, yes." On Friday, they rode into town together. Caleb paid Harlan Cobb the $300 before the magistrate and tore the note in two and handed the halves back to him without a word. Cobb's face went sour as old milk. He had come to take a desperate woman and instead found her flanked by a man of property and 400 acres, with 2 boys standing tall beside him and a baby on her hip, and not one of them in the least bit desperate anymore. Then Caleb and Ruth were married, that same hour, in the small church at the end of the street, with Samuel and Eli as their witnesses and the baby gurgling through the vows. It was not a grand wedding. She wore her one good dress, mended at the hem. He wore the shirt she had sewn the buttons back onto. But when the minister said the words, and Caleb Hardin looked down at the woman who had walked through his gate with 11 cents and refused to bend, his weathered face broke open into something the whole county had thought it would never see again. He smiled, and then, because he could not help it, he laughed, that rusty, joyful sound, and gathered all 4 of them into his arms at once. They went home together as a family, down the road she had once walked alone and exhausted and without hope. The land prospered after that, the way land does when there are hands enough to work it and reasons enough to want it to grow. Ruth set the accounts right and kept them right. Samuel grew into a horseman his father could be proud to call his son, and called him father he did, by the second spring. Eli got his whittled horse and a dozen more besides. The baby learned to walk in that kitchen, taking her first steps across the very floorboards where her mother had once knelt to prove she did not take charity. And the chair by the window, his first wife's chair, Caleb moved it himself one quiet evening into a place of honor by the hearth, and told Ruth the story of Sarah and Emma at last, all of it, the whole frozen grief of it, out loud in the warm room. And telling it, he found, did not break him. It set him free. It is a strange thing, how the worst day of a person's life can turn out to be the doorway to the best. She had arrived with 3 children and no money, certain that the man at the gate was as cold and hard as the land he stood on. He had watched her come up the road and decided she was a fragile thing who would weep and run within the week. They were both so completely, so fortunately wrong. For what each of them had mistaken for hardness in the other was only grief wearing armor, and what each had built their lonely life around, the vow to never again need another soul, turned out to be the very thing they had to lay down before either of them could be whole. He had said, "Stay as long as you need." She had needed the rest of her life, and so it turned out had he.